Is it using your camera?
Mm-hmm. Hello.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of our new live YouTube series, Conscious Conversations. We are your hosts, Sarah and Christopher, and we are excited to bring to you another episode. This one, just as usual, casual conversation, no bullet points, no script, just stream of consciousness, straight up flowing. This episode is about intuition versus ego. And remember, these topics are topics that you guys request us to cover. So we got our whole list going. We like to choose weekly of all the beautiful topics that you guys give us to choose from. So tonight, we chose intuition versus ego. And I find that is a topic that many people ask about.
Sure is. It's an interesting one too. We've explored this for quite some time. You know, we've talked about this a lot. It's quite a common theme that comes up amongst not only us but everybody else that we talk to. And how do you discern between the two? How do you tell the difference between the two? And there are some distinct differences, very distinct differences once you actually find out through both, you know, just going through life really and tapping into your own heart center.
And I think, you know, if we kind of like boil down the problem, I think most people's problem is self-doubt.
Oh,
they
absolutely.
don't know the difference between intuition and ego because they don't trust themselves to make the decision that it is in fact their own intuition.
Absolutely.
So I think, like, you know, first, when we talk about intuition and ego, there are so many definitions all across the board. But I think the most common definition that I've heard from when I ask my clients, what is intuition? Or when we're exploring the personal development realm, what is intuition? Most people seem to say intuition is knowing without knowing.
Wow, that's a nice one.
Knowing without knowing. Like, you just know something, but you don't know how you know it.
Sure.
So, like,
when I think of it, to boil this down really easily, like for me, when I'm thinking about these two aspects, intuition, ego. When I think of ego, I think of mind.
The chatter.
When I think of intuition, I think heart. So ego, mind, intuition, heart.
Or even maybe gut.
Gut, yeah.
Like, I like to ask people, think of a time that you have felt your intuition was just firing.
Yeah, butterflies. It's that feeling.
What's the sensation
it's
that
tingling.
shows up?
There's something going on. There's. I think it's different for everybody. I don't know, but I've found a lot of similarities across the board. You know, talking to people about this and what that feels like. But yeah, it's like this dance between the heart and the gut. You know, it's a knowing. It's an all-knowing. It's a feeling in the heart, and then also the gut as well. So.
You know, if you can put yourself in that peak experience and you just kind of close your eyes for a moment, you can really feel where that intuition shows up. And like you said, everybody's different.
Yeah.
But you can really feel. I know for me, my intuition feels like it shows up in my core right here. And it's this little voice in my head that chimes in, and my ego argues with it. It's my ego that starts to say, go away.
Yep.
Go away, not right now.
Like, it doesn't want it to come to the forefront because the ego is threatened that it might take over. And that's where I think we get ourselves into trouble.
Well, and it's interesting because the ego is not our enemy.
No.
The ego is not our enemy. The ego keeps us alive. The ego keeps us operating in this third dimensional reality. The ego, sure, maybe this is an illusion of separation, but we're playing in this illusion of separation, so you need an ego to play by the rules. Like, that's what keeps us
tied to this earthly realm. I think if we lose track of that, or the ego it's when I think of ego, I think of earth. You know, when I think of intuition, I think higher realms of consciousness. I think heaven. I think whatever you want to call it. You know, the astral realm. I think of fifth dimension and all of that. And that's a whole other topic. But these are the key words that come to mind when I think of intuition.
Well, and it's interesting because some people I know, when they think of ego, they think of like greed or selfishness.
Well, I think that's what's been associated with ego is that
having that big head.
Yeah. And that plays into that. It certainly plays into that, but it's not the overarching theme of what the ego means or what it means,
To me, the ego is the mental chatter that is great for safety and survival. But when it comes down to evolution, it's not, consciousness evolution. It's not so much the driving force. It's like intuition and ego have the same intention, and that is to protect us and to guide us. But they have different ways of going about it. It's almost like a mother and father. Like you might look at intuition and ego like a set of parents, and maybe the mother has maybe slightly different roles, the father has slightly different roles, but ultimately they all have the same intentions.
And when they come together in harmony, they work really, really well together. So that's the thing. It's okay. We don't want to banish one to the side and have the other one full force. And we have to work in some sort of symbiotic relationship. We need to work in harmony. And that's with all parts of ourselves. They all need to come together. One part can't be dominating. And I love, just since we've been on the topic of the masculine and feminine and bringing both of those into balance within ourselves. It's the same that goes with anything, like, and another thing that comes to mind, we live in this patriarchal system. Obviously, it's not working, right? It's too dominant on one side, especially the shadow side of masculinity. But the opposite would be true if there was a dominant matriarchal society. You need them to blend together in harmony. And it's the same thing with intuition and ego. They have to do this dance together, a carefully constructed dance that allows both parts to speak. And you can talk about that, obviously, with the clients you've worked with too, I'm sure.
Well, and the thing is, though, like if you're going to have that perfect blend of intuition and ego as guiding forces, you have to be able to distinguish between the two voices.
Yeah, that's very true. So how do we do that? How do you start to distinguish that?
To me, in my opinion, to distinguish between the intuition and the ego is to first get to know it, get to know what it sounds like. I have a client who actually just very recently was doing some deep exploration of intuition and ego. And she had a lot of questions for herself. Like, how do I know when it's my intuition and not my ego? How do I know? And, it's usually after the fact that your intuition is validated. You had a gut feeling, you knew something was coming, and it happened. And then you're like, I should have listened to my intuition. But at what point, because we're also very fearful, at what point do we think our intuition, or at what point do we think our ego is actually our intuition when it is our ego? So you see the danger here? If you hear fearful thoughts in your head all the time, and you think, oh, my intuition is telling me this, my intuition is telling me that, it might not be your intuition. It might be ego. And so then what happens? You're afraid and you keep yourself out of these experiences, or you think you know something about something when actually it's your ego based on fear. And then you say, oh, my intuition is telling me this. What if it's not your intuition? So you see like the conflict where people are like, well, how do I know that this is my intuition, this is my fear? And first, I think it's important to distinguish between the two. I find that for myself and for other people, usually, ego comes from a very fear-based way, because ego is our survival tool. So fear has kept us alive for the evolution of mankind. Fear has kept us alive. It's kept us safe. It's kept us focusing on our security. But we're not running from saber-toothed tigers anymore, right? So now we're just in a constant state of stress. So at what point are we able to say, okay, wait a minute. If ego is based mostly in fear because fear helps keep us safe, then what is ego or intuition? What is intuition? Intuition is usually looking at things from the broader picture. In my opinion, when I experience it, intuition is more inclusive. It's more unconditional. It's this knowing And as soon as you start arguing with it, that's when you can tell the difference between intuition and ego. Because when
Mhm.
you start arguing with it and it's not for your highest good, then you know that it's probably your ego trying to keep you safe, undoubtedly doing its job, thinking that it has your best heart or best interest at heart.
Mhm.
Whereas intuition just knows what's right for you. It doesn't have to argue you in, it doesn't have to debate you into a decision.
No,
It's ego that has to debate you into a
it's an
decision.
all-knowing, and that's why we say it's like you said before. It's that knowing, it's that feeling. It's just pure. It's pure stream of higher consciousness that's working through us. Say, okay, like if we were all to operate from that space, too, it'd be interesting to see how this world would be. I mean,
Mhm.
it'd be really interesting to see how everything would be, just because I feel like we're all operating from that place. We're more expansive.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
we're more expansive instead of, like you said, being in this constant state of fear all the time.
Mhm.
But again, it's not trying to talk down the ego.
It's just knowing
it,
what it's good for.
yep.
And it's kind of like what she did in her last session was she thought that ego was the enemy. Most people do. But when she kind of gave the ego a voice, she recognized that its positive intentions were to keep her safe from the pain of the truth that the intuition was trying to deliver. So let
So
that sit in for a second. That's powerful. The ego was trying, by arguing with her intuition, the ego was trying to protect her from the pain that would be elicited from the truth delivered by the intuition. The ego wanted her to be okay. It wanted her to be safe. It didn't want the intuitive knowledge to come true and then hurt her because the truth that the intuition was delivering was in fact painful.
mm,
But the intuition, in my opinion, if I see like the intuition as a person and the ego as a person, I see the intuition as like that very straightforward, blunt, kind of tough love type person who's like, this is just the facts. This
mhm,
is how it is. This is how it's going to be.
yeah.
This is for your best, highest good if you just face it now. Whereas ego is like, no, 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 no. We can go around and we can go here.
We'll
We can
wait a
go
little
this
while,
way.
but it's ultimately going to come back to anyways. It's like we can only run for so long. We can only run and get away from all of these things that we're terrified of for so long before it just comes back around. You're gonna have to face it, and if you don't learn it at that point, you're gonna learn it some other way.
And the truth that the intuition is trying to bring isn't fear based. It's the
No.
ego that associates it with fear
Mhm.
because suddenly you're threatened. This illusion of separation is threatened. Your security, your stability, all that you cling to for survival is threatened. So they work. They do have your best interests. When she realized that the ego was in fact just trying to keep her safe, she wasn't ready to deal with whatever it was an intuition was trying to show her anyway.
Mm.
So it has still happened in perfect timing. It doesn't mean it was any easier. Either way, the truth would have hurt. Either way. So I think the intuition, it almost chimes in when it's like, oh, let's soften the blow here by extending the time period. But this is also, if you're looking at it as intuition as only being the deliverer of painful news, it's also something to deliver positivity. It's also something like when we just know that our bodies want to eat melon all day. That's an intuitive insight. You don't know how you know, you just feel it.
Because when you're working in that symbiotic relationship with your body, with your mind, with your soul, when you're all working together and it's all working in harmony, they're all playing off each other. Your body's signaling to you at that time, say, hey, listen, like, take it easy on the starches. You had enough russet potatoes for the day.
I can never have enough russet potatoes for the day.
That is true. That is true. But it is, your body's saying, okay, let's ease up on that. I'm going to get a little lighter here, and I think that's hard for some people to distinguish right away, but it takes time to play around with that. So that kind of leads me to ask you, so what is the best way to discern between the two? I know it's practice, right?
Well, first, it's important to get to know the unique voice of your own intuition, your own ego, because not everybody's intuition sounds the same. Not everybody's ego sounds the same. They might come from similar sources. Ego might be more based in fear and restriction and control and, you know, putting things in like a certain order, whereas intuition is more expansive, inclusive, maybe sometimes blunt, but ready to take you to the places you need the most and deepest healing. So my client actually came up with a 4-step process. And let me see if I can remember all the steps. Her 4-step process for being able to not only distinguish between her intuition and ego, but to also make the best decisions for her was brilliant. And I walked her through this process to help her uncover her own perfect process. But first, I connected her with an experience where intuition was firing. And she got to know the way intuition shows up in her body. She got to know the way it shows up in her energy field. And she also got to know the ego's voice in that scenario. Where did the ego show up in her? How did it sound? What was it, the talk that it spoke? The talk that it spoke? What was the language it spoke? How did her energy feel? So that was her first step, is to, in any given scenario where she's doubting, is it intuition or is it ego? She slows down, she pauses, she stops, and she gets to know intuition and she gets to know ego in that scenario by giving them a chance to speak. So I do a lot of role-playing work with our clients, right? Where they get to step into these parts of themselves and actually speak as if they are that part. So she's familiar with this process, but she does it in free writing now. She'll ask questions and intuition will answer. She'll write down questions and ego will answer. So she gets to know the part by remembering what it feels like in her body when they show up. And then she starts asking them the questions. What are you here to teach me? What are you protecting me from? What do I need to learn from this situation? What do you want me to know about this situation? So they both have a chance to speak. You're not saying, oh, intuition's better than ego, ego's better than intuition. You're not doing that. You're giving them a fair shot at explaining themselves. And then she sees how these are in alignment with what she calls her future self. Now, I'm still trying to figure out something else to call it than future self, because that makes it seem as though it's something separate than us. And it's not. The point is to recognize that your future self is your present self. It's you revealing yourself to become that future self, what was already inside of you.
Manifestation at its finest.
Right. And so I'm still trying to find out a better language to use for that. But when she hears future self, she knows that means it's a part of her that embodies the qualities that she knows she has within her, but has masked for so long and covered up for so long. So what she does then is says, okay, so what my intuition and my ego has to say, which of these is in more alignment with my future self? You might say my highest self. You might say my truest self, my most authentic self, my purest form of self, and gets her answer. And then the 4th step, makes a decision based on the one that is in alignment with her truest, most authentic self.
I like that.
So you get a chance to listen to both voices. You get a chance to get to know what they want for you. And then you have autonomy. You get to make the decision what is in alignment with my highest good right now. And maybe it means going with intuition in that moment. And maybe it means going with ego in that moment.
It seems pretty balanced. It's like making a checklist, right, of these pros and cons, right? And really looking at it from an objective perspective instead of making a rash decision based upon what your ego is telling you or what your intuition is telling you. It's rather looking at it from larger picture, being the observer, taking a step back and looking at that. So it's an interesting way of doing it. I really like that method a lot. I think that's great. Again, though, I think these feelings, when it comes to feelings, it's really making mistakes along the way because we end up going with our intuition or our ego one time, and for some reason it leads us down the right path. Like, okay, well, maybe next time I should really listen to that gut feeling, and really,
but even that is perfect because you learn from that experience.
So it's really, there is no mistakes.
There's no mistake.
And that failure, as we've talked about and as we will continue to talk about, is never a problem. That is all for your highest good. So it's shifting perspective. But when it comes to getting to know both of these parts, I think it's worthy to note that we do need to take time with this and to really observe and go within ourselves to really see what this process is. Instead of just, we operate on autopilot. We operate, all the time, just kind of boom, 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 boom throughout life, where we're not really thinking about these things. So.
And sometimes I think when we do think about them, we overthink them and don't put it into writing, or we don't speak it out to another human being. That's why we're lucky, because we get to speak it out. There's not a single topic that goes unspoken. We have shared the weirdest, deepest stuff with each other as we process through them. Stuff that people might hide from their significant other, because that's how we grow. That's how we shift. We know that we're supported no matter what.
Yep.
I have never been in a more unconditional, judgment-free relationship in my entire life. And I obviously don't think that would ever happen again. And so being able to talk instead of having to keep a journal and privately share my thoughts, hoping he doesn't get curious one day and open it up, it's amazing. And I recognize not everybody does have that experience right now. So if you're not in a relationship where you can communicate through these processes, make sure you're journaling, or at least recording your voice speaking about it. Because when it's just in our minds, it gets lost in thought. It gets lost to time and space. You'll never remember it. But when you speak about it, that's why coaching's so effective. Because when you speak with a coach, you have someone who witnessed your transformation. That's what it is. It's bearing witness. It's bearing witness.
And even if you don't want to write it down, speak it out. Carry around your phone has a recorder on. 2018 technology, man. Your phone has a recorder. Just record your voice talking. Talk it out. When we're actually voicing it, it feels so right. It feels so good. And so by doing that, I think can be really beneficial. And obviously, as you say, we're extremely fortunate to have each other to be able to have these conversations and not hold back. There's no holding back.
There's no holding back. And that's a great way to get to know the voices of your intuition, the voices of your ego, and to check each other. Because sometimes we might think this is my intuition, but the other person might say, are you sure it's not your ego?
Yep.
Or vice versa. This is my ego speaking. Are you sure it's not intuition? So challenging the people around you, finding that person you can really open to, and if the very least, just writing things down and speaking them out. I think that if we can practice discerning between intuition and ego, and practice actually making decisions that are in alignment with our best interests and highest good, wow, the ways that our lives transform, the possibilities. I think, I can't remember who it was. It was someone on Oprah's Super Soul Sunday or something, and she said,
if you don't watch it, watch it. It's a good show.
Someone said something like, intuition is that voice in your head when you're on a diet and you grab a bagel and you feel like it's not what you need to be eating in that moment. But then ego is the one that justifies it and says, no, it's okay, and pulls you into it, because that's safety consciousness.
It's a good real life example.
That's safety consciousness at its finest, saying, oh, I will be emotionally fulfilled if I have this bagel right now. I'm not hating on bagels. I love bagels. Eat bagels.
Vegan bagels, baby.
Vegan bagels. I think bagels are naturally vegan.
No, there's some that have eggs and stuff in it.
You're right. You're right.
Yeah.
I don't eat much of these things, obviously. But anyway, the point is that you could replace that with donut. You could replace that with whatever food your body doesn't resonate with, but you argue with it as if it does. And then later you feel guilty about it or you regret it.
Mhm.
Your intuition knows what you want for yourself. It's like when you're binge watching a show on Netflix and you can just feel this voice inside you trying to say, is this right now the best use of your time?
Mhm.
And hey, maybe it is. Maybe you just need to binge watch a show on Netflix.
Everybody needs to binge watch a show on Netflix.
But what if you are trying to focus more on work or a project or personal development, and you know that watching that show isn't serving your highest good?
Yep.
But your ego will start justifying it and saying, oh, well, you need it for this, this, and that. But I'm not saying, it could be totally flipped too. Maybe you're working too hard and your intuition is saying, maybe you should just chill on Netflix. Like, the good and the bad is where we put our judgment to it. Judgment is what makes a thing good or bad, right? Which we should definitely do a whole episode on judgment. That would be a great one. I love it.
We have thousands
so
of
many
topics. But, to break this thing down and to really just kind of bring this thing all together, to wrap this all up, we went over the steps of what it means and how to discern between them both.
And how to use it. Listen to it.
Do you have anything else that you think would be valuable that people should know?
Yes, I do. I think
Let us know.
Using the synchronicity around you in your environment is one of the most resourceful things we can do for ourselves with building and strengthening our intuition. For example, intentionally entering a space with a question, looking for a message or a meaning or an answer, and then quieting yourself to allow the sensory information to deliver that message.
And can I add, to be open to whatever that message may be and where it may come from, because we may think that we know where that message is going to come from, but it shows up in many different ways, And so being open to the process, the unfolding of it, because I think that's when ego gets in the way. I don't know, this is how it's going to go. But no, being open to that.
Like when I'm reading tarot cards for people, I think in my mind, what does this person need to know right now in this very moment? And I quiet myself and I allow, if I'm hearing construction workers outside and people talking, walking down the sidewalk, just a lot of noise, most people might think that's a distraction, but to me, that's an intuitive message. What does that mean? What does that represent? I just asked this question, and now this is the sensory information I'm being delivered in that moment. To me, there's no mistakes. There are no accidents. Everything is perfectly orchestrated and happening all the time. And so imagining, using your senses, what images come to your mind's eye? What sensations come to your body? What sounds you hear? Smells, tastes. All of this is sensory information. It's the voice of our intuition. It's our intuition trying to communicate to us in a way that we can be the only ones to understand. Because if I'm hearing noise, it might not mean the same thing for you. You might have a different question to ask. But when you've made a connection, an energetic connection with someone, you can often exchange information through me experiencing something and asking, what does this mean to you?
Absolutely.
And it unlocks your intuitive voice.
Absolutely.
So that is more on like psychic gifts and abilities, but that's also intuition.
Which we will get into, because that's another one of our favorite topics.
But I think that about wraps it up. I think we've got a quiet night tonight. If you do have any questions and you're joining us late after the recording has already finished,
just let us know.
Feel free to drop them in the comments. Once again, submit your topics. We love the topics that people have recommended and suggested. These are all just to have a fun time hanging out, chilling, talking,
That's right.
following stream of consciousness, and exploring.
Well, you guys have a wonderful night, and that's a wrap. We will see you next week.
Bye.